Hi, welcome to the channel. I'm Lauro Miller and I make videos about programming. Today we're going to talk about Booleans. Those little true and false values that you come across quite often. You may be thinking there is not much to talk about, but actually it's quite easy to get confused when it comes to values and their relationships with Booleans in JavaScript. So we need to explore them in detail and understand what's going on behind the scenes. And that's what we're going to do in this video. Then let's switch to Notion and let's get started. Booleans in JavaScript. We will now move to discussing them in a little bit more details. I know we talked a lot about Booleans so far, especially when we talk about operators. But there are a few topics that we need to look into more closely if we really want to understand how Booleans work in JavaScript. So first things, we start by discussing how we convert other types to Booleans. Then we discuss what we already mentioned previously about truthy and falsy values. We talk about the ternary operator. This is extremely common, especially if you are working in React. You see this a lot of times, and even in other scenarios, other contexts, you will also see the ternary operator used quite often. So we need to understand what's going on behind the scenes and how it actually works. We then talk about some of general properties of logical operators, and then we talk about the AND operator, the OR operator, and the NOT operator. New file, as always, we will say new converting, like so, right? Converting.js, and I want to discuss a few different ways we can convert other values or values of other types to the Boolean type. The most straightforward and explicit way of doing it is by calling the Boolean, like so, right? This here is a object wrapper for the Boolean value, and once we pass a new value here, let's say 5, for example, it is going to return the Boolean equivalent of this value 5. If I save this, come back here to the terminal, let's clear everything for the sake of clearing everything, and node converting.js, we know that 5 is a truthy value, right? So we can convert anything to Boolean by wrapping it with this wrapper here. Now, if we want to, let's say, try something else, let's see how the Boolean of an empty string looks like, and it is also true, right? So non-primitive objects or objects, right? Objects are by default non-primitives in JavaScript. So objects, they are always considered true when converted to Boolean. Now, this is not always the case when it comes to type coercion, and that's where things start to get confusing. Let's give just an example, right? So we'll say console.log an empty array is equal to false, right? So we want to check whether an empty array is equal to false. Let's save this, let's run, and we get that, yes, oh, okay, the interesting, the empty array is being coerced to actually being equal or equivalent to a false Boolean. However, we know that if we explicitly convert the array to the Boolean type, it's actually true. So this is actually not equal to the equivalent Boolean of the array. If I run this, I get a false here, right? So we can see that the type coercion is doing something else behind the scenes, and behind the scenes what this is doing, it is actually coercing the empty array to its string primitive, which is something like this, and this string primitive is then being compared to the Boolean of the object, which is true, right? But we know that the empty string is actually equal to false, so this is where the whole confusion is coming from. And another example of interesting fun facts in JavaScript. But nonetheless, Boolean is one of the ways of coercing the type, or not coercing, but converting it to a Boolean. Another way is by calling the double negation, or not, right? And this is going to first take the Boolean negation of the value, and then it's going to flip it, so we will get the Boolean equivalent of the value. Now this is going to be true as well, because we know that objects in JavaScript are always true, right? Or they are truthy. So this is another way of converting. It's perhaps a little bit shorter, but it can get quite confusing, right? It's perhaps hard to visualize because maybe we don't know directly what is being coerced or what is being converted. I'm making a little bit of confusion here. Sorry for that. This should be what's being converted to Booleans. So this is a slightly shorter, but it's easier. It's harder to isolate, or it's harder to visualize when compared to the explicit word Boolean, right? Another way of doing it is by using the ternary operator, which we will discuss in a few minutes. So the ternary operator has this structure. Let me just write this down for you. There is a condition here. We are going to evaluate this condition. If the condition is true, we will evaluate some expression here, and we will return the evaluation. Return evaluation of expression if true. If it is false, we will return here eval of expression if false. Right? So we're going to have a condition at the beginning. This condition is going to be evaluated. If it is true, we are going to evaluate this expression here, and we are gonna return whatever is in here. If it is false, we are going to evaluate this expression. We're going to return whatever is in here. So how do we use this structure to convert a certain value to Boolean? Well, we'll simply say console.log. Let's say 10. And is 10 true? Well, if it is true, then just return true. If it is false, then just return false, right? So what I'm doing is I'm taking whatever value is in here. If it is a truthy value, then we are going to transform it explicitly to true. If it is a falsy value, we are going to transform it to false. Let's save this and let's execute. We should get true, right? If we change this to 0 here and we save, then we are going to get false, because 0 is a falsy value. This brings me to the next topic. So before we go into the next topic, let's now properly mark this as completed, and we're going to discuss truthy and falsy values. So I'm going to create a new file, truthy falsy.js. And here, what is a truthy value? Truthy value is basically any value that when you convert to Boolean, so within here, right, this is equal to true, right? So any truthy value that when converted to Boolean, or any value that when converted to Boolean equals true or leads to a true Boolean is considered a truthy value. Falsy value, as you may imagine, I'm pretty sure you can reach the same conclusion as what I'm writing here, is any value that when converted to Boolean leads to a false Boolean. Couple of examples. We already know that empty strings are equivalent to false, or kind of equivalent to false. So if we say Boolean of an empty string, we should expect false. So an empty string is a falsy value in JavaScript. 0 is also a falsy value. Undefined is a falsy value. Null is a falsy value. NaN is a falsy value. NaN, not a number, is a falsy value. Let's see what this prints on the screen. Here, back at the terminal, let's run again. True, 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 false. Oh, sorry, I'm running the wrong file, I think. Yes. Node, truthy, falsy, and we get false, 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 right? Everything is false here in the IDE. Now, an interesting one. We'll talk about this more when we are talking about numbers, but I just want to see the result. What if I put infinity here? Is infinity falsy value or not a falsy value? It is not a falsy value, right? The infinity is not a falsy value, even though it has some interesting behaviors in JavaScript. So this is what would be considered a truthy value, right? Just because we discussed here NaN, I think it makes sense that we also show the other possibility, which is the infinity. And a couple of more examples. Any objects here that we have, so an empty array, an empty object. We can have, let's say, a string that is non-empty string, ABC. We can have any number that is different than 0. All of these possibilities, variations here, they are going to be truthy values. Save this, execute it again. We got true, 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 right? Pretty cool. And as you can imagine, we can use these things here and these things here to actually run conditions, to run checks in JavaScript. So if we say if ABC like this, we are gonna let's say console.log I'm a truthy value, else we will say console.log I'm a falsy value, right? Let me just erase this whole thing here up, because then we don't print unnecessary stuff in the console. If I save this, we say I'm a truthy value, so ABC is a truthy value. 0, however, is a falsy value, right? So the truthy values can also be used to kind of compare or check for in a more compact form. You can just pass the value here. If it is a truthy value, the if check is going to evaluate true. If it is a falsy value, it's going to evaluate to false. That's pretty much it for the discussion about truthy and falsy values. Let's have a little better look or closer look at ternary operators, because important thing here, they are not equivalent to if statements. Okay, they are not equivalent. They behave slightly different. They are sometimes used interchangeably, but they are not equivalent to if statements, and I want to make this difference clear now. Let's create a new file here, and that's going to be ternary.js. Okay, so the ternary operator, as we already discussed, we are going to store, or we are going to run some comparison here. If this comparison or if this check is true, we are going to do something here. If it is false, we're going to do something else here, right? So condition was true, and we'll say here condition was false, right? And then here we'll say we can maybe, let's say, let x, and then we maybe put a number here, 0, and then at the end we'll say we're always console.log the result, and we will reassign a value for x. We're going to say 10, and then we'll say the same thing over and over again, right? So maybe here I just copy and paste this whole thing. It's a little bit faster, and a bunch of times, and then we have x equals 10, console.log result. Actually here I would make more sense for me to declare the result here at the top, result, and I will say result here, and then result here, and then we say x equals 10. This is going to be, so we will start with a condition was false. This should print condition was false. Then we switch to 10, we print condition was true, and then we switch to, let's say, an empty string, and then we are going to output the result, which is that condition was false. We save this, come back here to the terminal. Let me clear everything. Node truthy, oh, not truthy, sorry, node, what was it? Ternary, exactly. Condition was false, condition was true, condition was false. Okay, now the difference here, I think it's quite clear to understand. It's a simple operator. I mean, not too much magic happening. It's just a shorthand to evaluate a certain condition, execute a certain expression if the condition is true, otherwise execute another expression. Now, I said the word expression twice, and that's where the difference is, right? So the ternary operator and the if statements, they are slightly different, but they are very different, right? They are different in nature, which means that the ternary operator, it executes expressions conditionally, and the if statement, it executes statements conditionally. The operands of the ternary operator, which means like the little parts of the ternary operators, they must be expressions. Now, expressions in JavaScript are blocks of code, they're pieces of code that can be evaluated to produce a result. Now, one example, I mean, everything, almost, not everything, but a big part of the things we were working until now, they are expressions. So 1 plus 2, for example, is an expression because 1 plus 2 is evaluated to produce a final result of 3, right? This is an expression. Let me just comment this because then we don't have the warnings from the IDE, so it's better. 1 plus 2 is evaluated to produce a result of 3. But not everything is an expression in JavaScript. There are also statements, and statements are blocks of code that are executed to actually perform a certain action. We are not really interested in what they evaluate to, but we are interested in executing some actions in the code. Now, the ternary operator, as I said, expects an expression, right? And the if statement expects statements or statement blocks. So let's try to write the same thing with if statements and with ternary operators. So imagine the scenario. We want to have a couple of conditions. So let's write two conditions. Const A is equal, or condition A is equal to true. And we have condition B is also equal to true, right? Or maybe here we can say to false. And we say if condition A, then we want to execute the code, which we are going to also test for condition B, right? If condition B, and then we want to do something here. Let's say console.log, both are true, right? So we are allowed to nest if statements here, but if we were to try to do the same with ternary operators, so condition A, and then we say, okay, if condition A is true, then we actually want to have a condition B here, and if condition B is true, then we want to console.log both are true, right? And then here you see that, well, this starts to complain here. There is here this squiggly line. If I were to just leave it like this, we have a problem. So if I save this, come back here to the terminal, let me clear the whole thing, and here we'll see node ternary, like so. You'll see, oops, there's something wrong with this conditional expression, right? So it's not exactly the same thing. The problem here is that we are missing the evaluation part for when this check is false. So let's try to add this here. We're just going to say undefined, and we are still missing something. We're just going to say undefined, and like this it should work, right? Let's save this and let's see what's going to happen. And if I save the file, let's try, well, if I run this, of course, it's not going to happen because here it is false. So once I save the true, we are going to console.log both things on the screen. Now, as you can start to guess, this here is much harder to understand than the one here, right? So here we are simply executing a bunch of commands based on certain conditions. If this is true, execute whatever commands are in here. If this is true, execute whatever commands are in here. Here, on the other hand, we are actually producing a value depending on whether the condition is true or false. But we always need to produce the values for both true and false. We cannot just say, okay, produce the values only if true. If false, don't do anything, right? So we always need to provide the case for when the conditions evaluate to false. Now, this can get quite confusing, and it can get very, very hard to understand, very hard to break this down into its individual components. What I would suggest is that the ternary operator is very useful for when we are doing assignment to variables. So for example, okay, here we are, let's do it like this. We have condition A, condition B, and then we want to have some result here, right? And then if both are true, then we want to have this result to be equal to both are true, right? Or to make it even less complicated, let's just take into consideration condition A. You can play around with this as you want as well. And here we can make this a little bit easier to understand. We'll say, okay, to understand, if condition A is true, then result is going to be both are true. Otherwise, the result is going to be, and then here, of course, it doesn't make sense to have both. A is true. Oh, my English. Nice. A is true, and then here A is false, right? So here we'll say else result A is false. And you can see that the ternary operator can actually be much more compact than the if statement, right? This is useful and I use it a lot. but we also need to be careful about how we use it. And this is exactly because we are, as you can see here, that there is a slight difference. Here we are performing an assignment operator, and we are performing it twice. We're performing it once if the condition is true. Otherwise, we are performing a different assignment operator if the condition, or operation if the condition is false. But here we are performing only one assignment operation, and the right hand of this assignment operation, it depends on the value of a, right? So if a is true, the value that we will assign to result is a is true. If a is false, then we assign this second string. So we are interested in the value that is produced by this whole ternary operator, while here we are simply assigning the value. We are not evaluating anything based on condition A. We are performing two different statements. We are performing two different blocks of code depending on the value of A, but here we are doing something else. Yeah, I know maybe it's a bit confusing. I know that the line is very thin. We didn't discuss expressions and statements to a big extent so far, but I just want to bring it to your attention that the ternary operator is not the same thing as an if statement, and if you start using both always interchangeably, you may run into trouble. Ternary operator check, properties of logical operators. So new file here, new file, properties.js, add to git, save this thing, clear the whole console. Nice. Let's discuss some properties of logical operators. The first one is called value preservation. It's like, wow, cool. Nice name. What does this mean? Well, let's do a few console logs. 10 and 20, for example. What do you expect that this is going to produce? Maybe you would be expecting true, but no, not really. Let's see. Node properties. Oh, it outputs a 20. Okay, well, that's interesting. What if I were to say something like this, 10 or 20, right? 10 or 20. Maybe we could also expect true, and so here we're gonna write 20, like so, right? What's going on? Let's save this. Maybe you say, okay, this is also going to output 20 as a, oops, 10, right? This one outputs 10. What is going on behind the scenes? And this is actually due to the first and the second. I mean, here it's also the second one is also playing a role. And the second one I will write already here is short circuiting. Circuiting, like so. But value preservation simply means that when we are performing logical operations, we are going, or JavaScript, not we, but JavaScript is going to retain the original value of the operands that are passed to the logical operation, and it's going to return this value once the operands, or once the operation successfully completes. Now, when does the operation successfully complete? Well, that's when short circuiting comes into play. Short circuiting means that JavaScript will complete the whole logical operation, and there are three logical operations that we need to be aware of, or the most common ones are the and, the or, and the not, right? So for JavaScript, it's going to complete the operation as long as it has enough information to conclude its final value. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, let's write this down here again. And for the AND operation, we need to understand that AND, I'm gonna write here, AND is true if and only if both operands are true, right? Both operands are true. And the, and the OR operation is true, or better, false, if and only if both operands are false, right? If you are not familiar with truth tables, have a quick look online. They are quite easy to understand. But the idea here is that the AND operation is going to be true if and only if both of the operands, the left and the right ones, they are true. Now, here we have a condition where the first operand is true, but we cannot yet specify whether this whole thing is going to be true or not. So if I were to, let's say, 10 and 0 here, so let's do a little bit of cleanup. 10 and 0, this would evaluate to false, right? So if we get 10 and 0 here, this would evaluate to false. I'm gonna save, I mean, it will probably not print false on the screen, but I just want to show you, or maybe it will, let's see, JavaScript, so interesting. No, it doesn't, it prints 0, right? So it returns the right one. And this is exactly how the operands behave on JavaScript. So it's going to be, if the first one is falsy, okay, here I think I don't want to get confused, so let's write it down here. We're going to say not A, then return A, otherwise return B. That's for the AND operator, So if A is false, right? So if the first operand is false, let's say 0 here, then this is already enough for JavaScript to know that the whole AND condition is going to be false, because the AND condition needs to be, or needs to have, both operands equal to true in order to evaluate to true. So if the first one is false or falsy, right, that's where the falsy values come in, then it's going to return that first operand. If, however, so here we could say, we could have, for example, 0 and 10, and this is going to return 0. So I'm just going to comment these two things out, and let's run this code again. Here it returns 0, right? So if the first operand is a falsy value, it's going to return the first operand, because it knows, okay, if I have a false in the first place, the whole AND condition cannot be true, because it is only true if and only if, or it's only true if both the operands are truthy values. Now, if we have a truthy value here in the first place, however, something like this, 10 and 20, for example, then it's going to look, okay, that's truthy. So now I need to actually look at the second operand, and then I need to return that second operand. That's why in this case here, it's going to return 20. So if I run this, then it returns 20. Now you may be wondering, okay, how does this relate to Booleans? Well, how does this relate to logical operators? Well, that is exactly where the truthy and falsy coercions or conversions really play a role. So if I write 10 and 20 here, then we say, okay, these two values here, they are truthy values, which means we are going to return the 20 here, and because it's true and true, this would evaluate to true, right? So if we turn this to 0, for example, we would have true here and false here, and this whole thing would evaluate to false. If we turn this into 0 but this into non-zero, or a truthy value, then this whole thing still evaluates to false. And if we have 0 and 0, this is also false. Okay, so I know, yeah, a little bit complicated, but at least you are now getting an understanding of how the two properties of logical operators then they behave in JavaScript, right? So for example, let's do something that is done sometimes. I don't see this very often, but let's give it a try. Result is equal to 10 and 20, right? And if we were to console.log the result, then here we would have 10 as the result, right? So if I save this and then I run, oh sorry, 20, because the first one is truthy, then we go to the second one. So here, if we save this, then we have 20 here. Now, where would this play a role? Well, maybe we are interested in having something like this. So let's do a little bit more complex example. Person is equal to, and then it's going to have a first name, and that's going to be, as always, because I'm super original, Lauro. And we're going to say const is first name defined, right? And I will say if is first name defined, we're going to say person dot first name, right? So if this value is truthy, then we are going to do something with this. Now we'll say result is going to be is first name defined. So if the first name is defined, we'll say is first name defined and person dot first name, right? So in this case, this should output my first name. Let's save this, and then exactly as expected, because this one is a truthy value, it goes to the second part of the operation and it returns the actual first name of this person object, right? So that is for the AND operator. And I know that here we talked a lot about the AND operator, but we have sections in the video that we're going to talk about the OR and the NOT operator. So I can actually come here to Chrome and mark the properties of logical operators as completed. And I think that we have discussed the logical AND to quite a good extent. If you want to play around with this, also feel free to do it, because it is, I understand, a little bit hard to comprehend it in the first place, but it really helps you understand how this whole logical comparison happens behind the scenes, especially when there is so much type coercion, conversion, and so on happening behind the scenes in JavaScript. So I'll just copy this to the logical AND file, and I'm going to create another one for logical OR. And let's see how short circuiting works for logical OR. So we saw here that OR is going to be false if and only if both operands are false. So if for AND we take not A, then A, otherwise B, for OR is going to be almost the same. But for OR here, let me copy this also from here, here for OR, false if and only if both operands are false, which means that if the first operand is true, this, using short circuiting, this is already enough to determine the whole result of the OR operator. If we have true and whatever, right? Oops, not like this. True and whatever, not and, but OR. If we have true or whatever, the whatever doesn't matter, because we know that as long as we have a true here on the left side, the whole thing has to be true. So if the first operand is true, then we are going to return the value of that first operand. If the first operand is false, then we're going to return the value of the second operand. So I'm going to copy, because I'm super original. Oops. I'm going to copy this whole thing here, and let's paste this in the OR file. Now we're going to do it like this. 0 or 10, 10 or 20, right? So 0 is a falsy value, which means this is going to jump to the second operator, right? The first one is false. And now JavaScript is saying, okay, false. I'm not able to determine the result yet, because if the second one is true, then the whole thing is true. But if the second one is false, the whole thing is false. So I need to return the value of the second one. So this is going to output 10. And if we have 10 or 20, we're going to look at the first one and we'll say, okay, that's a truthy value. So I'm satisfied already. I know that for an OR logical operation, it is enough to have one truthy value so that the whole expression evaluates to true. So this will also return 10. Let's save this. And here we clear everything and we'll say node logical OR. And once we run this, we get 10 and 10. Now, one very common use for this operator, which is now there is a better use, but I just want to show you because you may come across this quite often when working in other code bases, is to use this OR here as a way of establishing a default value, right? So let's say here val with default, and then we will say something like this, const I don't know, result here, or some value, right? And we're going to say that this value is 0. Better, even better, let's say undefined, right? And then we're going to say the value with default is going to be value or default, like so. And the idea here is that because JavaScript, because of the value preservation property, we will have a look at the first element. If the first operand, if the left side is a truthy value, it is going to return that value. Otherwise, it's going to return whatever value is on the right side. And because it keeps the value, it does not convert it into its Boolean equivalent, then we can use the OR operation to actually set a default to a certain value. Let's say we are not sure whether this value is going to be populated or not. So we want to be on the safe side in our program and define a default value for this variable. Now, if I were to console.log the val with default, like so, and come back here to the terminal, let's run this again. We default to the default string, right? If we change this to ABC, for example, then this is going to output ABC on the screen, right? So this is how the OR operator is used to create default values for a certain field. Okay, now, of course, this is problematic, right? Because we have not only undefined and null as falsy values, but we also have 0. And 0 is a falsy value. And let's say that this should be my counter here, right? And only say here counter, and then we will say here sanitized counter or something. And we want to have counter or 1, for example, right? But or counter and 0 here. Or maybe that's not a good example. Let's say, let's go back a little bit because it's going to get complicated. But let's say here value again, and then we, for some reason, we want to assign this 0 to this variable here. So we're going to say value or default, right? And we save this, and then we try to run, and of course, bam, we have a default here instead of 0, and that's because 0 is considered a falsy value. So if we use it here for the OR statement, then this is going to not work or may not work as expected. Same thing for an empty string. Let's say that we want to assign this empty string here, and then we have a default string. Of course, these are all fabricated, let's say quote unquote teaching examples, but I just want to illustrate that this OR here is used, or it will cause the default to be assigned to this variable, not only if the left-hand side is undefined or null, but also if it is any other falsy value. A better operator here to check for undefined and null is this one, nullish, coalescing. I don't remember. I don't know how to pronounce this exactly in English. Sorry for that. But this one is actually equivalent to something like this. It's going to say value is equal. I don't remember. So value is different than undefined, or value is different than null. No, I don't remember how to translate this, but the idea is that if this value is undefined or null, then we are going to assign the default to this value with default. Otherwise, we're going to assign the value. Okay, let's save this. Let's see how this works. Now we have an empty string here assigned because the value is an empty string. It's not undefined nor null. If we have 0 here and then we have something like this, then we will be able to assign 0 to the value with default variable. Okay, there is this is new. I think it was introduced in quite recently, 2020, I think. Yes, 2020. So it's a quite new operator. It's safer, I would say, or at least it makes it more predictable to work with undefined and null values, but you will most often come across the OR operator. Okay, this is still used, I think, more often than the nullish operator, but if you have the opportunity to use it, then why not, right? It's a good way, it's a safer way of defining a default value for a certain variable. Oh my, this video is getting long. Okay, we are done with you didn't think that there was so much about Booleans in JavaScript, right? And we're just talking about Booleans. Booleans can be true or false, but there is just so much to talk about it. And we'll talk about numbers, we'll talk about strings, we'll talk about many other things. So yeah, just want to give you a good understanding of the language, not just the syntax. Syntax, you can watch some previous video. I will put the link, I think, on the cards somewhere here in this video. Syntax is there, but as I said, learning syntax doesn't really make you a JavaScript programmer, right? So let's finish this up with the logical not. And luckily for us, the logical not is, well, just the negation or the Boolean negation of the value that we have. So logicalNot.js. And here what the logical not is going to do is something like this. So we have here for the OR, we have this something like this. Why not put this for the not, right? And the not, we are going to say A awesome, return true, otherwise return false. So it's really, sorry, not A, right? So that is missing the operator. If A is a truthy value, then, or if A is a falsy value, not A is going to evaluate to true. If A is a truthy value, not A is going to evaluate to false. So let's just, best way is always to do a few practical examples. Not A, right? Not A, well, A is a truthy value, so this should be false. Not an empty string, this should be true. Not 0, this should be true. Not 5, this should be false. So let's save this, clear the console here, node logical not. False, true, true, false. Okay, yeah, we nailed it. This one is easy, right? Console.log not an empty array. Console.log not an empty object. Let's see. False, false, right? Because this is considered a truthy value. This is considered also a truthy value. So if we negate them, we get the false. Now, this is why we can use that double not operator. So if I come here, where was it? It was in the converting. Yeah. Do I still have it? Exactly, I still have it. So that's why we are able to use the not here to actually get the Boolean equivalent of these other types. If we were to put 2, or if we want to put twice here, then what it's going to do is it's going to negate whatever Booleans we had before, and then this will be Booleans in the end, right? So this would be true, this would be false, this would also be false, and this would be true. Oops. This would be true, and this would be true. So let's compare. True, false, false, true, true, true. Perfect. Okay, nailed it. Awesome. Come back here, mark this as completed, and this completes the discussion around Booleans that I wanted to, or that I had planned for this part of the course. As you can see, there is a lot going on behind the scenes, and we really need to understand the principle so that we can work with Booleans correctly. In the next video, we jump into numbers, and we're going to explore a few different aspects of numbers in JavaScript. As always, if you don't want to miss it, subscribe to the channel. You'll get a notification once the video is out. I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.